Hi, I'm Charles with AniCap. The story begins at a magical academy where a talent for magic is valued most. Our protagonist Will has no aptitude for magic and wonders if there's any way for the talentless like him to advance at a magic academy. He isn't sure, but Will frequently goes to dungeons to slay monsters so that he can get stronger even if he can't use magic. One day at the academy, the distracted Will gets called to the front of the class. He is told to conjure a flame using a catalyst, but Will trembles in fear because of his lack of magical talent. Of course, he fails to conjure anything, and the entire class laughs at him. The instructor is really disappointed because this academy is very prestigious, and it's embarrassing how Will can't even use the most basic magic. This makes it clear to the instructor why Will is said to only be an honor student when it comes to note-taking. He says that Will is completely beyond help. Just then, a student named Scion conjures an amazing flame from his seat. Scion gives an insincere apology by saying that he was just helping Will. The instructor puts out the flame and declares that this was an example of how in this world, the supremacy of magic is absolute. Magic is strength, and mages are their heroes. At the academy, a student's talent for magic is how they earn a higher rank. However, a no-talent student that can't even use a bit of magic has no right to be at an academy that gives rise to powerful sages. After class, Scion mocks Will for going into the dungeon again because he's just going there to take out small fry and scrape up some credits. Some girl named Colette intervenes, but Scion can't understand why an honor student like her would defend such a nobody. Colette declares that Will is the hardest worker she knows, and she refuses to let anyone insult her friend. Everyone is shocked to hear her speak this way, but Scion points out that it takes a lot more than hard work to become a Magia Vander. Will stands no chance at becoming one, and Scion is done wasting his time with a no talent like Will. Scion agrees with the instructor as he tells Will to drop out of the academy, but Colette tells Scion to get lost already. Colette consoles Will by pointing out that there's something wrong with their professor, but Will can't blame him because he is right. Will does some smooth talking and tells Colette that as long as he has a cutie like her by his side, then he doesn't care about anything else. Colette gets really flustered and Will apologizes because he was taught at a young age to compliment girls. He says that her cuteness is completely objective though, and this just gets her even more flustered. Colette reminds herself that she is the heir to a noble and she must remain composed. Just then, Colette becomes concerned because Will has gone completely silent, and he explains that he's just admiring how nice of a day it is. Colette then explains that the Magia Vander, who are the most powerful wizards, continue to uphold the sky. Long ago, people were trapped in darkness and didn't even know about the existence of the sky. The world was being terrorized by something called the Celestial Host, but 5 wizards rose up against them. The wizards sent the invaders packing, and they cast a seal over the sky while bringing peace to the world. The title Magia Vander is a title given only to the strongest, and it has been passed down for ages. When Will was younger, some girl named Elfaria told him stories about what lies on the other side of the sky. There is said to be a beautiful sunset that turns all kinds of things bright red. She thought that if they could become Magia Vander, then they would be able to see the sunset. Will wanted them to see it together, so they swore that they would. Will realizes now that this was just a childish promise, but Elfaria was the real deal. She was an incredible talent, and she became the youngest to ever earn the Magia Vander title. Because of this, she left to the top tower, and the talentless Will was left behind. Will is unable to give up on the promise they made, so he works hard so he can stand beside her one day. Afterwards, Will is scolded by Professor Werkner for going to the dungeon again. The worst part is that Will went to the 7th floor, and Werkner fears that Will lose his life one day. Will apologizes and sheepishly asks about his credits, which just gets Werkner more upset. Will did eliminate an evil guard in the dungeon though, so Werkner awards him with 2 credits. Will couldn't be any happier, and Werkner is shocked that he hasn't given up on becoming a Magia Vander. Will wonders what is so wrong about that, so Werkner explains the difficulties that lie ahead for him. Before heading to the tower, Will have to advance to the Upper Institute. To do that, he will need to be proficient in the 3 curricula. The curricula are writing, spellwork, and praxis. He will need a ton of credits in all 3 of them, but Will can't use magic, and he will never be able to earn spellwork credits. Will knows this very well, which is why he focuses on collecting praxis credits in the dungeon. Unfortunately, Werkner must remind Will again that advancing through praxis alone is impossible. Will gets pretty dejected, so Werkner lifts his spirits by telling him to forget about becoming a Magia Vander. Instead, he needs to worry about actually graduating from the academy. Will failed to earn credits in the most recent exam, which means he needs to earn 4 credits by the end of the week. There are only 2 days left, so Will desperately searches his notes to find a monster worth 4 credits. Werkner wants to help him, but he doesn't want to get in trouble, so he says that he's simply talking to himself, and he reveals some report about a certain monster on the 6th floor of the dungeon. It's called a Baskerville, and it's exactly what Will needs, so Will thanks the helpful professor. Unfortunately, Scion heard everything. He comes up with an evil plan, and he is sure that it will finally get rid of the no-talent scrub who is out of his league in this academy. A while later, we find Will on the 6th floor of the dungeon. Will has fought a Baskerville before, so he's eager to earn his 4 credits. He tells his worried cat friend not to worry because he will avoid the monster's flame breath so they don't get burned to a crisp like last time. Nearby, Scion and his cronies search for the monster. They want to take care of it before Will does so that he will be expelled for being short on credits. Scion's buddies are worried about being on the 6th floor, but Scion reminds them that he is one of the elites at the school. Scion has some serious issues as the very sight of seeing Will offends him. He doesn't even believe that a no-talent loser should even be able to speak about the Magia Vanders, and he thinks Will doesn't deserve to be at the academy. Just then, things take a horrifying turn as a monster utterly eviscerates one of Scion's men. This thing is terrifying as the kid's blood drips off its fists, and Scion's friend screams in horror. Will hears the scream and rushes forward as he fears that someone is being attacked. Will demonstrates incredible speed and arrives to see Scion in battle. He is shocked to see that the monster is an evil sentinel because he has never seen one in person before. This beast is incredibly dangerous and it's worth 10 credits. This terrifying monster usually resides in the lower levels of the dungeon, so Will wonders why it's there. The terrified Scion begs for the monster to stay away as he attacks it, but his magic isn't having any effect. Scion doesn't stand a chance, and Will realizes that the sentinel is on a whole other level. Scion desperately fires away, but the fearsome beast just keeps approaching, so Will decides that he has to do something. However, just then Will shocks himself as he wonders if he actually has any obligation to save Scion. Scion has done nothing but make fun of him, and he has bullied Will to no end. His mind is flooded with memories of how poorly Scion treated him, and he begins to think that leaving Scion behind to lose his life would be justified. However, Will remembers something that Alferia told him. She said that he was kinder and braver than anyone she has ever met, and we see that she was the one that gave Will his glasses. Back to the present, Will says that Alferia was wrong. He isn't kind or brave, he just wants to do whatever it takes to stand beside her. Will puts on his battle glasses and dashes forward. He stops the monster's immense attack and declares that he will become a lone sword. Back at the school, Professor Edward urgently tells Werkner that Scion and his buddies went to the dungeon without permission. Werkner is in disbelief, and Edward tells him to use his familiar to find Scion. The kids are in serious danger, so Werkner prepares to do so and asks what floor they're on. Edward explains that they went to the 6th floor, and he is shocked when Werkner declares that if they went to the 6th floor, then there's no need to worry. Edward reminds him how dangerous the 6th floor is, but Werkner explains that everything is fine because that is the floor Will is on. Back in the dungeon, Will demonstrates his immense fighting ability as he fends off the sentinel, and he manages to slice off one of its fingers. The infuriated beast tries to attack Will, but the kid is just too fast. Will soars around the cave and easily deflects the debris that the monster throws at him. Eventually, Will makes it onto the monster's back, and Scion watches in shock as he can't believe that this is the same Will from school. The professors watch the fight from a crystal ball, and Edward can't believe what he is seeing from Will. Werkner then reveals that Will is a true outlier. He has superhuman strength that a mage would never possess, and a body as tough as a dwarf's. That isn't all though, as he also has incredible observation skills that allow him to grasp an enemy's strategies after seeing them just once. Will demonstrates this by dodging an attack the monster just used, and he uses this opening to slice its arm off. Werkner concedes that Will cannot use magic, but in this world filled with magic users, Will is the one and only warrior. Will now takes the monster's giant sword, and as the beast becomes infuriated, Will gets ready for an attack. Scion hasn't moved an inch this entire time as he is stunned by Will's strength. The monstrous beast unleashes a powerful beam attack, but Will stops it with the sword. Werkner continues to explain how powerful Will is by declaring that his slash of the sword surpasses even lightning. Will shows just that as he slices right through the monster's beam, causing massive damage everywhere, and the monster is utterly defeated. Will shows concern for Scion, but Scion is so angry that he makes himself bleed from the mouth. Edward is just as upset, as he refuses to believe that someone who can't use magic is able to surpass magic. A while later, Will returns to the academy to find the very upset Werkner. Will did manage to eliminate the Sentinel though, so he officially awards Will 10 credits. 5 years earlier, we see how terrible Will felt while everyone whispered behind his back. They had never heard of someone who couldn't use magic like him, and everyone wondered how he got into the magical academy. Everyone just assumed that he was used as bait to lure his friend Elfaria to the school. Elfaria had already become a Magia Vander at this point, so the other students assumed that he would be kicked from the academy. Will went to meet with Headmaster Cauldron, and she put a dagger in his hand. Without saying a word, she prepared an attack, and Will sprung into action. He pushed Werkner to safety, and before Werkner could even hit the ground, Will neutralized the Headmaster's attack with just a dagger. Cauldron and Werkner were absolutely stunned, so the Headmaster could only laugh about Will's amazing display of skill. Werkner was then shocked when she declared that Will be allowed to continue attending the Magic Academy. Werkner reminded her that Will is unable to use magic, but Cauldron was extremely intrigued by Will. He was like a sword that yearned to be a wand. Surprisingly, Will still seemed unhappy. He just wanted to know if he would be able to ascend the tower if he kept studying at the academy, and if he became strong, would he be able to be with Elfaria? Cauldron gave him hope as she declared that if he remained undaunted and stood strong, he might be able to achieve his goal. After he left though, Cauldron admitted that she had no clue how things would end for Will, the sword attempting to become a wand. Back to the present, Werkner lectures his students on what it means to ascend the tower. This generally means advancing to the upper institute to become one of the Magia Vander. To reign from the topmost floor like they do, a person must be recognized by the highest center of learning. There are two main ways to advance. One is by creating a new type of magic, and the other is by earning at least 7,200 credits at the academy. Only a very rare few have been able to create a new type of magic, which means that the majority of students rely on earning credits. Werkner scolds all his students though, because they're not even doing well enough to graduate, let alone reach the upper institute. After class, Colette sees how exhausted Will is, and she brings up how everyone is talking about how tough Professor Werkner's class was. Werkner is especially tough on Will, but Will knows that it's because he has completely failed at spell work. Will refuses to be deterred, however, because he believes that being a failure doesn't mean that he shouldn't still work hard. Will is grateful that Werkner gives his students supplemental classes because some professors like Professor Edward don't seem to care. Just then, the two overhear Scion's friends telling everyone that Scion defeated an evil sentinel all by himself. His friends admit to being overwhelmed by the beast, but when they woke up, Scion had slain the sentinel. Everyone thinks that Scion will become one of the top 3 at the school because of this, but Scion is furious because he knows what really happened. Scion spots Will, so he rushes to him and angrily expresses his disbelief. Will is supposed to be a talentless loser, but he was somehow able to fight really well. Colette breaks up the altercation, but Will doesn't tell her anything about what happened. In the headmaster's office, the angry Edward demands that Will be expelled. Cauldron points out that Will is already in his 6th and final year at the school, and it would be cruel to expel him after he has come this far. Edward is furious though, because he doesn't think the academy needs someone who is a warrior and not a mage. Being able to surpass magic without being able to use it is blasphemy to him. Cauldron checks Will's grades and explains that he more than excels at everything other than magic. So much so that he will have several paths to choose from outside of being a Magia Vander. She declares that the academy has a responsibility to produce great scholars for something she calls the Fated Day. This just further emboldens Edward, so he explains that the issue is Will is determined to become a Magia Vander. That fact is clear to everyone, so Cauldron sees his point and declares that Will should be tested. Also, because Edward has learned Will's secret, she instructs him to administer Will's test personally. If Will fails Edward's test, then she will entrust the matter of his expulsion to Edward. Even Edward is surprised by her decision, and he reminds her that he's not as lenient as Werkner. Cauldron is not concerned, so she leaves the contents of the exam up to him, and Edward gets a sinister smile on his face as he leaves. When he leaves though, we see that Cauldron is pretty confident, so she wants Edward to test Will as hard as he can so he can see the truth for himself. She believes that Edward is the best for the job because he understands the Magiavander better than anyone, and that is why people call him the Dark Viper Mage. Elsewhere, Will apologizes to Colette because she always has to help him do magic things that he can't do himself, like opening his magic locked locker. Colette doesn't mind, but she notices that he still keeps his sword in his locker. Will explains that he has to because he has never been given permission to carry it on campus. At the study hall, Will writes a report about one of his favorite battles. Dwarves were a race from another world, and they were severely mistreated. They were overworked and even treated worse than the elves. Because of this, they raised an army and waged a war. Colette wishes he wouldn't work so hard, but Will explains that if he loses even just one credit, he won't be able to advance to the Upper Institute. This report isn't too bad though, because he can understand how the dwarves felt. This is because even in the face of the mightiest magic, they continued to fight. They never gave up, and such determination is what Will believes is necessary to overcome magic. Professor Werkner taught him this saying, and it's just another reason why Will must do his best. Colette then notices that Will has a white hair. He rejects her offer to pull it out, but she insists. Just then, Edward interrupts them and instructs Will to come with him to the spell hall. Edward explains that he can't allow Will to continue failing spell work, so he has decided to give him a supplemental lesson. Will is shocked, and Edward tells him to be grateful. He declares that he will ascertain Will's worth himself, but Will is shocked when Edward uses a magic attack against him. Edward simply explains that Will's assignment is to land a single strike on him, and refusal is not an option. However, if Will succeeds, then he will award Will with his first ever spellwork credits. Will is stunned by the opportunity to receive 5 spellwork credits, but Edward reveals that if Will fails, then he will be expelled from the academy. Edward prepares his next attack, and declares that those without talent should not be permitted to even look at the Magiavander. Edward has given Will a reason to fight, so he decides that it's time to begin, and he unleashes the attack. Back in the headmaster's office, Cauldron reveals to Werkner what she has done. She tells the shocked Werkner that Edward is conducting a test, and he's forbidden from interfering. Cauldron has recognized Werkner's advocacy for Will, but she must also recognize Edward's concerns. She has already decided that Edward will ascertain whether Will is worthy of attempting to become a Magiavander. Werkner struggles with how cruel her choice is though, because Edward is the closest person to becoming a Magiavander. Edward was ultimately defeated before, but he's still an ascendant. He has reached the top of the tower before. Edward demonstrates his fearsome abilities now, and Will is shocked that he was able to generate so much power by only using a low-level dark magic spell. Will is no slouch though, and he shows his incredible speed, but his kick is stopped, and Will realizes that Edward's defense is impregnable. Edward mocks Will for kicking a magical shield, and he calls him hopeless. Will is knocked back by a powerful attack, and he's stunned to see that Edward is casting spells with no incantations. They activate instantly, and there's no hole in Edward's offense or defense. Things aren't looking too good for Will, as he realizes that he can't even scratch Edward, and we see that Will's familiar named Kiki runs off. The confident Edward announces that the only magic he will use are his black flames to burn Will, and his shield to repel Will's poultry attacks. Edward prepares his next attack, and Will is horrified to see that he's overlapping a single spell. The attack was extremely powerful the first time, but now he's going to unleash a barrage of them. Edward declares that the talentless need to disappear, and he unleashes the attack. The attack is impossible to escape, so Will is struck several times as Edward demonstrates immense control of his magic. Will is in really bad shape now, and he begins to realize that he can't beat Edward. He is shocked to see what a top-tier mage looks like, and Will wishes that he had his sword. Nearby, Colette worries about Will after hearing that he was going to have supplemental lessons with Edward. She fears the worst, but she is surprised when she sees Will's familiar. Kiki is injured, but she still scratches at Will's locker, and Colette realizes that something bad has happened to Will. Kiki is clearly distressed, so Colette urgently opens Will's locker. Back with Will, Edward points out that if he can't handle someone like him, then Will has no chance at ever becoming a Magiavander. Edward then brings up the war involving the dwarves and explains that they foolishly incited a rebellion with the force of 10,000 dwarves. He then asks Will if he knows how many mages it took to end the battle. Will tries to get up, but Edward forces him down and angrily reveals that it only took one mage. With a simple wave of his wand, a single mage was able to annihilate 10,000 dwarven warriors. Edward angrily declares that this is the way of the world and a sword will never reach a wand. He wants Will to abandon his aspirations, but Will refuses and proudly announces that he wants to reach the Magia Vander. Edward pushes him away and demands to know what drives Will to fight so hard. Just then, Will stands defiantly and declares that he wants to be with the person he loves. This answer shocks Edward to his core, and Will continues by saying that he wants to keep the promise he made with Elfaria. Edward is disgusted and refuses to believe that something as simple as love is what is pushing Will to reach for the apex of magic. Will understands how foolish it must seem to Edward, but he doesn't care how difficult the path will be. He is determined to see the sunset with Elfaria. Just then, Colette arrives at the perfect moment and she gives Will his sword. Will thanks her and gets ready for a real fight. Edward calls Will a deviant and points out that he cannot win with the sword. Edward promises that he will defeat Will as he unleashes another attack, but he is stunned when Will slices right through his magic. This makes it clear that he's using a Moria blade, but Edward doesn't care and launches another attack. Will thinks about how terrified he is as he can tell that Edward is going to launch another barrage. This is because it's a terrifying volley of 1,000 flames. Will can't stop his legs from shaking as he acknowledges that Edward is a powerful barrier between him and the Magia Vander. Will really wants to run away, but he knows that this is the only way through the barrier. Edward declares that the fight is over as he sends out his barrage of magic attacks, and Colette calls out to the charging Will. Will masterfully maneuvers through the attacks and thinks about how there is actually more to the story about the Dwarven War. There was a brave dwarven general named Gareth that fought even as he lost all his comrades. In spite of everything going on around him, he was able to land a single blow. After the battle, in honor of his bravery, the mages recognize the dwarf's status. Just then, Will launches a brick at Edward's barrier and it shatters everywhere. Will then takes to the sky as he declares that the dwarven story is an example of a sword seeing a wand and reaching it. Will uses the ceiling as a launching pad and he sends himself right through Edward's barrier by slicing through it. The battle then reaches its dramatic conclusion as both fighters point their weapons at each other. Edward is then stunned and furious when he realizes that Will cut him. He walks away, but he also declares that Will is rewarded 5 credits. Colette runs out to check on Will, but he's completely exhausted. Cauldron is very impressed with Will, and Werkner points out that Will chose to dive straight into Edward's barrage. He hid himself and attacked from a blind spot overhead. That isn't all though, as Cauldron points out that Will used a strike powerful enough to break through Edward's shield. Will managed to use a slashing attack capable of overcoming magic, and in her amazement, Cauldron declares that it was truly as if Will was undaunted. Thanks for watching my recap. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach 700,000 subscribers.